Hey everybody, welcome back. Like I promised, I'm going to break down the six pillars into their own component parts, just to show you a little bit about how complex it can get. But also, this is going to be somewhat of an introduction to how to interpret um, regression output. It's a very common statistical tool that's used in a lot of the research that you're reading on the syllabus. So to kind of help you, if you're interested, there this as the kind of secondary purpose of this walkthrough, you'll get a little bit of you'll become. My goal is to make you a little bit more comfortable looking at those things and being able to figure out what's going on. But before I get going, I want to emphasize that this is not going to be a comprehensive um, uh, overview of all the different variables involved in campaign strategies. Um, and that is also the case for the six pillars, right? You personally have already identified after watching that one or two different pillars that you think are relevant for campaign strategy, and that's totally valid, and you're probably right about that. Instead, the point of these kinds of overviews are to show you just the some of the important considerations that campaigns make, but also give you some insight into the political science that's kind of covered some of these. And the ones that I think are especially relevant for the 2024 election. That is the presidential election, of course, and sometimes congressional elections too, and local races. All right, so let's get started right away. So if you've taken a statistics course or something like that, you might recognize that the notation might be a little wonky here. Don't mind that. This is again just for illustrative purposes to illustrate the how to kind of understand the process rather than getting the notation perfectly down. So we're starting off with this PR and in parentheses win. You read that as the probability of winning. Now, in a lot of elections, but although not all, many of the ones that we're familiar with in the United States, you either win or you lose, right? So this is usually a oh shoot, this is usually that's okay. Let me erase that. This is usually a binary variable that's either a one or a zero. Okay, now that's not entirely relevant for us because we could get more complicated and talk about how that matters statistically, but for our purposes, we don't need to worry about that. What we are worried about is instead what different variables, what different factors are involved in determining what the probability of one candidate has to win an election. Okay? In other words, if candidates need to balance a bunch of different factors, like we discussed in the previous videos, in order to maximize their chances at winning the election, this is breaking down just what those factors are, and in other words, what those variables are, and how important they are to determining the probability of the candidate's the probability that the candidate wins. Okay, so this works by taking the perspective of a single candidate, and it helps us compare kind of if we could just reverse everything, add like a minus sign to the end of everything, and that would tell us pretty much the probability that the other candidate wins, right? It's just the probability that we win is the probability that they lose, okay? So, taking the perspective of one candidate, we begin by identifying that the probability of a candidate winning is just a function, that's what that F means, of a bunch of these variables, okay? A function just means that we need to take into account these variables and take into account how important those variables are in determining this outcome, the probability that they win. Okay? So we'll start with going through each pillar that I had identified in order. So first is the variable, which is actually a vector, and all of these are actually vectors. The pillars are such broad categories, right, that they contain variables within them. Okay, so they are not entirely the variable themselves, although you can kind of consider them to be in a way. They are what are known as vectors containing variables within them. Okay, so let me show you what that is. So, formal institutional support, right, is equal to, and this is just vector notation here, a set of variables that all fall under this umbrella of formal institutional support. So you have things like, and we discussed this a little bit before, congressional endorsements. So people in Congress who are already part of the game, who have already established a good deal of credibility for themselves, and whose voters are interested in what they have to say, these can be helpful in swaying other voters, right, and increasing the chances that a person gets elected. Standard stuff. This is not too surprising for many of you, I'm sure. So similarly, you have bureaucratic endorsements. So this includes people who aren't in an elected office, but are major or even minor players in different agencies, departments across government, both federal and local, right? So, if the cabinet of the president starts endorsing somebody else, that's a big deal, okay? So similarly, these endorsements, the other side of them, so this variable, again, these are all different variables, right? This is its own x, this is its own x, this is x2, x1, I guess, right? These range from positive congressional endorsements to denouncements, right, on the other side. And that means if a candidate does enough to, as I said before, piss off people, then they might go out there and say, this person is terrible and you shouldn't vote for him or her. So that would just be, just thinking about it mathematically, this variable would range from positive to negative, right? Positive endorsement, negative denouncements. All right. Now, additionally, like we also mentioned, here's a third variable within this vector. You'll have concern over relationships in office. All right, and I'm going to put relationships in quotes. Because it's not necessarily like, being friends with people. But once these candidates are elected, they need to consider how easy it will be for them to govern, okay? Because for many candidates, they are interested in running again after they are elected for the first time. And if they're in their second if they've reached their term limit, if they're like a president, right, they're worried about either their legacy or their opportunities after they're the president to like maintain some influence in society. That's something that people want, of course. All of these considerations contribute to this variable, their concern over relationships while they're in office, right? If they're pissing off people during the campaign and they get into office and all these bureaucrats and all of Congress starts hating this person, then it becomes much less likely to have a successful tenure in office and reap all of the rewards from doing so. Like I said, again, having a positive legacy, or just all the other stuff that people do after they're president or in office. In another office, I guess. So they're really worried about undermining, okay? from people who they've pissed off during a campaign. Or obviously, if we're not talking about campaigns, they could be making these people angry while they're in office too. But again, we're focusing on campaign strategy here. So here's a second component, and this is, or maybe a third, this is another component of this probability function that we are building right now. We need to weight these variables in terms of their importance, okay? So each of these variables has their own weight, again, in terms of how important they are in determining the outcome of a race. We usually, in statistics, at least in political science, assign what is called a beta coefficient to each variable, and that tells us just how important that variable is, okay? So in order, just for simplicity's purposes, we can kind of just, I don't know if this is okay to do statistically, so don't quote me on this, but we're just going to take kind of the average of all the importance of all of these different variables within the vector, right, this thing in the brackets, and assign it to the pillar itself, okay? So that means that for our chosen candidate, let's say it is Donald Trump, right? We can determine, or we can guess. This is pretty much what we're doing here. We're making educated guesses as to exactly what this beta coefficient is. In other words, how important is the formal support, or the support of formal institutions for Donald Trump's chances at winning the election? Well, if you think about his plan to, at least his threat to fire a lot of Schedule F employees, civil service workers in the bureaucracy, then that means that this variable doesn't matter that much, because they might not even be in government to undermine him, right? That was something that he was that he had to deal with in his first term. His solution to that is, to get rid of those people and put in people who wouldn't undermine him, who, he doesn't have to worry about pissing off, right? So he can piss them off all he wants during the campaign if he anticipates just firing them later on. Of course, in terms of, people's expertise, the bureaucrats' expertise in what they're doing, it's probably not the best thing to do, given how complex, governing massive, industrialized, advanced societies is. But for, politically speaking, I'm sure Donald Trump very much would find it much easier to do what he wants if everybody is basically a yes man. All right. Now, the other side of this is that he's getting a bunch of denouncements, right, from Congress and, his former, a lot of his former cabinet members, the people he himself appointed, are now currently, denouncing him and endorsing Kamala Harris. So that's going to benefit Kamala Harris a little bit. It's going to hurt Donald Trump a little bit, but it seems to not have affected the polling that much. Donald Trump has, throughout this race, remained pretty steadily in the mid to high 40s, okay, regardless of what happens. So ultimately, this race is pretty much just going to come down to what Kamala Harris's campaign can do. But that means that for Donald Trump, right, from the perspective of Donald Trump's probability to win, this is going to be kind of a small number, right? Coefficient is low. And because these coefficients are just mathematically, they turn out to be decimals, right? This is probably going to be a 0.01, right? If we go from 1 meaning fully, if 1 equals this thing fully explains the outcome of the election, to 0, right? This thing is not relevant at all for the outcome of election. From the perspective of Donald Trump, this is a pretty low coefficient. It has a low level of relevance. And that means for Kamala, it's pretty similar, right? Because if it's, and this is erasing the grid. Oh no, it's still there. Because if something doesn't matter for Donald Trump to win, then it also doesn't matter in terms of him losing either, right? It's just, again, the reverse of these things. The thing is, from the perspective of Kamala Harris, right, we can think about it a little differently. She might view it, and her campaign team might view it as more important, okay? So from her real perspective, she might be really concerned about ensuring that she gets as many Republican endorsements as possible, because she feels like this is going to be really determining the outcome of the election, right? So it's obviously debatable as to whether it's really zero point 0.01 or not. Maybe some people would argue that these will end up influencing voters in major swing states. You know, they really like to see that someone like, what's his name? Why am I blanking? Dick Cheney is supporting Kamala Harris. Like, wow, that's amazing. So instead of 0.01, maybe that is really an important thing. So it might be closer to, I don't know, 0.2 or something like that. All right. But, you know, some might make the case that that's actually going to hurt her campaign or is hurting her campaign. It's up to debate. Like I said, these are educated guesses. All right. So the next one is donors, right? This is our next pillar. Now, I'm going to save this for later because, like I said, this one is I think, really interesting and something I'm pretty passionate about. So if we have time, I'll break down what matters for this. Okay, let's see. So after that, we have volunteers. Okay. And for volunteers, remember, this is a vector. This larger umbrella variable is a vector of a bunch of smaller variables that are relevant to, volunteers on a campaign. So, what matters for these volunteers and their impact on campaigns? Well, like we discussed a little bit, you have the candidate's ideology. Remember, a lot of the volunteers are activists. They're a little more passionate about politics and relatively more extreme. So if a candidate doesn't have the right policy positions that they want, that's a problem, and it might depress their willingness to go out and help out on the campaign, okay? So that matters. Next are emotions, okay? And this is, of course, another important part of a campaign. And it matters, we'll see this later, right? We'll see emotions, and a few of these matter later. Probably ideology too. Yeah, definitely ideology too, just in slightly different ways. For volunteers, emotions matter because, during campaigns, people feel a range of emotions from anger to anxiety or fear, enthusiasm or joy, right? And like we've discussed, emotions have different effects on people's behavior. We've talked about it in the context of like information processing, and maybe identity too. I can't remember right now. But when it comes to campaigns, there's been some research on this, and because emotions affect people differently depending on the emotion, we might expect something like anger to encourage people, motivate people. Again, it's an approachive emotion. You want to do something so that you can return to equilibrium and not feel angry anymore. That's what, that's the function of anger as an emotion. The social and a biological function of anger. So this when your volunteers, your activists are angry about something, which they often are during a campaign because they feel like the other side is doing something to harm them, that's going to be helpful to get them out and on a campaign. The kind of inverse, the flip side of that is anxiety, right? This does sometimes the opposite, but not always. It depends. If someone's feeling really anxious, they might be too anxious to do anything, okay? So they might just sit at home and put the blanket over themselves, eat a lot of chocolate, and wish for the best, because that's really all they can do. Or they'll try to just think about other things. And from a campaign's perspective, they want to avoid people getting to that level of anxiety. You want a little bit of anxiety because you want people to know what's at stake. But you probably want more anger instead. So, it's a balance, but definitely leaning towards the anger. Here's an interesting one, though. Enthusiasm. Back to the 2024 election, the presidential one, Kamala Harris is banking on this one, right? She wants to have this joy campaign and hopes that it does similar, it has similar motivational effects that anger does. She wants people to feel enthusiastic so that they are motivated to go out and support Kamala Harris. Like, just happiness. And there's, again, been some research on this, but it's a little bit more mixed compared to, like, the clear effects of anger. Enthusiasm can get people to, both go out and help the campaign, volunteer for a campaign, but it could also make them feel a little bit too optimistic, and therefore feel like they're not needed on a campaign. So they're aware of this, the Kamala campaign is, so what they have done is essentially try to emphasize the fact that the race is so close, right? If you've paid attention to some of the ads that they're putting out, this is a common refrain that they keep saying, like it's the race is really close, like the race isn't over, whatever. So this is a balancing act of trying to get all these different emotions in a correct kind of combination. And you have to worry about getting people too angry because you don't want your supporters going out there and committing, acts of violence, because that looks bad for your campaign. All right. So the next variable in this vector of volunteers, that's a alliteration for you if you wanted some of that, is identity. Okay, and this one's pretty straightforward, right? If you just take everything we learned about identity, people want to increase the status of their group. Usually, we're talking about, for volunteers, we're usually talking about political or ideological identities here. And so, when these are the identities that are salient to these people, and they're strongly identifying with them, they're really concerned about, getting their party or their ideology higher status. And how do you do that? You go out there and win elections. And maybe you win elections by a lot, right? The more you win, the better status, etc., etc. So that's what they want, because it makes them feel better, because, as usual, like I've said, like I've tried to drill into you, their identity is part of who they are, how they see themselves, and if it looks good, they feel good about themselves as individuals. All right. They're extra motivated, just to make it clear, because of that, they're extra motivated to go out and campaign and try to maximize the chances that their preferred candidate, wins the election. All right, last thing that I'm going to talk about is socioeconomic variables. And if you've noticed, each of these kind of have their own vectors. Like, this is a broad vector, but each of these has subordinate variables within them. So it's like vectors within vectors. Again, I don't even know if that's allowed in statistics, but I'm doing it. So, it is for our purposes. All right. So, socioeconomic variables, right? These include, and the ones that are especially important for volunteers are like, their ability to volunteer because they need they're volunteering for free, right? They're not getting paid. So if you're giving your time, you might need to have some extra funds to be comfortable enough to actually do that. Now, if you've ever worked on a campaign like I have, you have a lot of young college students and people who aren't really that wealthy. Some of their incomes are entirely just from the campaign, and the campaigns are usually not paying them that much, depending on which campaign you're working for, of course. So a lot of these other things are really pushing them beyond their time motivation, or I should say, they're outweighing their time and money concerns. Now, if someone is living paycheck to paycheck, or they're anxious about where they'll get their food, their next meal, or whatever, it becomes much less likely that they will go out and start volunteering, right? So this variable is really directly related to all these other ones, and an increase in these, depending on which one, right? An increase in all of these means that these then become a little bit less important. Okay, that's kind of how it works. Again, a lot of this is just a trade-off. Okay. Now, other kind of socioeconomic variables matter too, but I'm going to save that for the next pillar here, which is the voters. Okay. Now, the voters are really complicated because statistically speaking, these are 100% determinative of the outcome of an election, depending on the race. Now, you could say that in all races, they're 100% determinative. All right, so this should be one, and you'll have a problem known in statistics as multicollinearity, or like in regression statistics, or something like that, right? Because the more voter the more this is entirely predictive of that, the less you're able to actually build out an equation and try to figure out how important all of these are. Okay, I'm going to pause here to kind of explain what I'm saying a little bit more. So, like I said, this is a bit of an introduction to conceptualizing, understanding what a statistical regression is. It is not exactly how one is built. This is not how you formally would build a regression. Don't get me wrong, okay? But, right, when you're doing regressions in statistical analysis, what you're really doing, and what is done today, is just you're compiling a bunch of different variables, you're typing them into your statistical software, and you're asking how well those variables, taking into account each other, predict a dependent variable of interest, one single dependent variable of interest. Again, for us right now, it's winning, right? How well do these variables help to understand, help to determine what is necessary, or what is probabilistic, right? What is most probabilistic in the outcome of winning. And once it does all its, fancy statistical analysis, again, usually almost 99 out of 100 times done with the statistical software, it ends up just spitting out values for these beta coefficients, all right? We don't determine them. The statistical model does, okay? And you can just, if it helps to think about this a little more visually, it's just helping us create a line of best fit. We have a lot of data, and we want to use all these variables to determine where the line of best fit is. That kind of minimizes the distance between the variables and this nice little equation that we're making with all these variables. All right, so if we have one variable, say the voters, that is exactly proportional to winning an election, then the statistical software will be like, hey, this is not, you're not giving me, or you're giving me like too much information at that point, or not enough, depending on your perspective. And we can't tell you what the rest of these, how influential the rest of these variables are, because this one's just dominating everything. It's become the alpha coefficient, if you will. No, that's for intercepts, but we don't need to get there. So that would be the problem statistically, okay? A little bit into the weeds there, I know, but if you're interested, there's a little bit of insight into that. So keeping that in mind, right? We're gonna look at this a little bit differently, right? Because number one, in a presidential election in the United States, at least in 2024, you have an electoral college, and the votes aren't directly related to whether or not you win an election, but they are definitely like the popular vote. If we think about this variable, this pillar, as the popular vote, and not necessarily the complex combination arrangement of votes across the country in all these specific states, and how the swing states ended up going. If we just look at it as the popular vote, we can kind of make better sense of this, okay? So, all that aside, what we're really doing, if we want to get technical about this, is looking at all of the different sub-variables that influence the popular vote, that kind of make up the popular vote, all right? And you can probably also make a different equation using voters, right? This is more of a function of these things rather than a vector. That's all well and good, but to follow the theme of, just trying to build a long, comprehensive or semi-comprehensive model of, probability of winning an election, we're going to talk about all of these different variables that are at least somehow related to vote share, right? Amount of votes you get, proportional. So, we're going to see a lot of the same variables as we did in the volunteer one. In this case, we have candidate ideology. But the difference between these two, again, statistically, this might be a problem, but don't worry about it too much. And you could probably have a function of a function going on, but we're not going to get into that. The difference between voters and volunteers is that candidate ideology, even if it matters the same way, in the sense that voters want their candidate to have an ideology that's more in line with them, it matters probably a little less than volunteers. Okay. But that is, we can get into the weeds on that too, right? Some volunteers are more political identifiers, more party identifiers, partisans. Others are more strongly attached to ideologies, right? So for the political identifiers, the partisan identifiers, they're not going to care about the ideology at all. Obviously, the ones that more care about their ideology will care about it. Okay, so this variable might matter less than volunteers or more, just depending on what kind of people we're talking about. And obviously, you have a lot of these kinds of identities who don't go out and volunteer for campaigns. We're seeing emotions again. And they're working again in similar ways, but not exactly the same, right? Because we're not having people go out and volunteer anymore. We want them to go out and vote, okay? And same thing. All of these things, all of these different emotions have weird effects when it comes to their predictive power and whether or not somebody goes out to vote. Anger is, again, a really good motivation. Okay, so this is, probably going to get people vote. If people are anxious, if they're a little anxious, they're worried about the other party doing something they don't like, they'll go out to vote. If they're too anxious, they might be too scared to go out and vote or something like that. And if they're really enthusiastic about something, they're really feeling this wave, then they'll go out to vote. But if they go like overboard in some way and they just feel like it's not worth their time or something, because their candidate is definitely going to win, then it kind of backfires and they don't go out and vote. Okay, so again, not a clear, easy, one sentence explanation for how these different factors will definitively lead to the probability that somebody gets elected. Okay, it gets really complicated. It all depends on how these things work together and how like the magnitude of each of them, whether they're high or low. All right. Okay, so like I mentioned, identity matters, but this time, in addition to political and ideological identities, social identities are also going to matter. I mean, they matter for volunteers too, but I want to focus on social identities here a little bit. And this is based on a lot of the stuff we talked about in previous lectures, especially the unit on identity. If people are feeling status threats in their society, they're going to be extra motivated to make sure that their status is either improved or solidified, and they'll vote for a candidate that does that. And I should mention, before I get too far and I forget again, I would say that these beta coefficients are probably similar for both candidates. I don't have like a full number for them, like an actual number, but I'm gonna guess that volunteers matter probably at 0.2 to like 0.3 out of 1. And voters obviously are still gonna matter a lot, probably like 0.7 to 0.9. And we're not adding up to 1 here, but that's okay. Sometimes that happens. All right, so is there another one? Oh yeah, and lastly, and it's the same thing again, because turns out voters and volunteers are just regular people. They're just kind of doing different things. Socioeconomic conditions. Similar for volunteers, right? If people personally don't have the time or the money to go out and vote, right? It's sometimes election day happens in the middle of a working day, or even afterwards people are working long hours just to put food on the table. It becomes much more difficult for them to justify going out to vote. Because again, they need money from working. Secondly, you have the systematic elements to this, right? And this also applies to volunteers. The systematic element of socioeconomic conditions is that, right, these are conditions across different communities or society overall. And that means that we're not just only talking about the socioeconomic conditions of a one person, we're talking about it in terms of a lot of people, okay? So if a lot of people are feeling these worsening socioeconomic conditions, or potentially improving socioeconomic conditions, that means that you'll have a bunch of people feeling that they don't have the time or the money or whatever to go out and vote. But not only that, they might use these socioeconomic conditions as their reason to vote and who to vote for. So their vote choice, right? Some people at least believe, they would tell you, there's kind of a debate about this in political science as to how likely this is and how frequent it is or whatever, how prevalent of a phenomenon this is. But a lot of people will tell you, well, I voted for this guy or this person, this girl, whatever, because the economy's really bad. okay, and I want to vote for someone who I think will do better with the economy, or just someone who's not that person because they're so bad with the economy, okay? Uh, and this social part is also important too, because socioeconomic is not the same as sociocultural. So I'm gonna add that sociocultural. I didn't have that in my notes. Like I said, this is not a comprehensive thing. There are other variables in these vectors. But some people will, with the same argument, say, I don't like what's going on in society. I don't like, that. Pick your social issue. I don't like that abortions are illegal or legal. I don't like that, trans people are either being banned from sports or they're playing in sports. Whatever it is, right? These are also reasons that people decide whether or not to vote and who to vote for. Okay, so this is an important one. Also included in the vector. And of course also applying to volunteers because they care about ideology. And these things obviously map onto ideology too. Like I said, a lot of these variables are super related to each other. Or in other words, interrelated. But you could make the case that somebody hasn't developed like a real formal ideology on something. They haven't formed like a solid opinion as to what should be done about something or whatever. But they just kind of have like a feeling, like the general vibe in society. In the economic sphere or in the sociocultural sphere, the vibes that they're getting from it are just kind of pushing them in a certain direction. And I'm going to add another thing, vibes, all right, which may or may not be the same exact thing as emotions. And here's part of the reason why they might not be. So there's been some research that suggests, and we talked about this a little bit in discussion, that voters they penalize incumbent officials, elected officials, if they're presiding over a period in which like a natural disaster occurred. Okay? So if, say, a hurricane happened during somebody's time in office, the argument is that there is a substantial segment of the population controlling for all these other factors that I've identified here, and I think I have more. I'm looking at my notes. Of course, I have more. I'm sorry, but controlling for all of these things, even like over and above these different factors that we're talking about, people, for some reason, even though it's not totally rational, like this politician, well, unless you're Marjorie Taylor Greene, who thinks that somebody is actually directly responsible for these things, there's no reason why a single politician is responsible for, a natural disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, a flood, whatever it is. Still, a lot of voters, according to this argument, you might think, "Oh, this is nonsense." But if you're interested, I'll show you the research. A lot of voters still get bad vibes and kind of project those bad vibes onto that politician. Like someone needs to be held accountable, and my vote is what's going to make that person held accountable for something that they probably weren't responsible for. So again, not rational. Vibes are usually not rational. Usually. But again, not totally always bad for people, right? Because if somebody gives you bad vibes, like they see there's something about them, your intuition might be correct, okay? Like we are evolved human beings with instincts that have helped us survive for a long time. So sometimes our instincts help, sometimes they hurt. All right. I'll just write down the example. Penalty for natural disasters. Okay. Here's some other other variables that are important that you'll see when you look at the political science on these issues. Um, and again, really related to these other things, no doubt, but people's trust in the political system, right? Their efficacy, their self-efficacy, right? Whether they feel, if they were talking about trust, whether they feel like, they can participate in a system that is so corrupt or something like that. Why bother? Like, why be a part of, why contribute to a system that is like evil or something like that, right? Or if it's your self-efficacy, if you feel like, your vote doesn't matter, or that you don't feel like it's part of your civic duty or something like that, that's technically not what efficacy is. It's mostly whether or not you feel like you're able to make a change in something. But still, all of these kinds of contribute to whether or not you feel like you're feeling like you're willing to go out and actually vote, of course. And there's a bunch of other predictors that we didn't talk about, that political science has looked at. People will look directly at variables like identities, specific identities like gender differences and propensity to vote for genders, race, ethnicities, socioeconomic status, stuff like that. Okay, but of course, these themselves are related to all these other things. So it's messy, it's complicated, and that's why you see races like the 2024 election where you see, like I've said this before and I'll say it again, pretty uninterpretable, difficult to understand strategies. And until the message becomes very clear, until you kind of zoom out a little bit and you're starting to see, the polling kind of not shifting in your direction, like you're not getting the endorsements you want, whatever it is, then you can try to change course and test the waters in that regard. Okay. And that is partially what's happening right now in Kamala Harris' campaign. She's, I know I mentioned in the previous, I asked about like her play it safe strategy where she does minimal media appearances. Now she's just got approved for an interview with Fox News. Pretty sure this is a reaction to J.D. Vance going to the New York Times. But it is something that people have demanded for her to do. Nonetheless, not necessarily go to Fox News. I think it's actually really good that she's going to Fox News. Should Kamala supporters be kind of scared? Maybe. But she's done enough interviews to get some practice in, so we'll see. We'll see how that goes. All right. And this is the variable that we're really interested in, right? The coefficient on this one. Like I said, it's going to be close to 1 because voters determine the race anyways. But where the voters are going, right? Who people are going to vote for, it remains to be seen. We'll see later. All right. Now, the last one, if you remember, is credibility. Again, this one I'll save for later. I might even save this for another unit. I doubt we'll have time for this. So I'm going to wrap this up with putting a nice parenthesis there. But one last thing. If we want to create a not just a kind of a probability function that's not really mathematical, it's just kind of identifying all the factors involved. If we want to determine, like if we want to build out an equation, it's going to look like something like this, because like I said, it's pretty much an either or, you win or you lose. This is an exponent, that's alpha, and this is just a matrix notation. This includes all the vectors that we talked about. We don't need to talk about this though, okay, because it's obviously statistics. I don't even like statistics that much. So I'm going to show you this um, in a... I'm not even going to talk about this in terms of probability. If we just want to talk about the amount of votes people get, right? And let's say that similar to the probability that someone wins, you can use all these other pillars to determine, how many votes you get. Oh, didn't mean to zoom out like that. What we'll do, and this is kind of the regression coefficient you'll see, just to kind of map this all out in a clear way. You have you can also just think about this, y equals mx plus b, if you remember this from, I don't know, algebra or something. If you ever took algebra in primary school, you'll be looking at your b term here, which is just the alpha in statistical notation, regression notation, plus the coefficient of our first vector, beta 1 x1, and this is going to be the formal institutional support plus beta 2 x2, your donors, plus beta 3 x3, and then you'll also go on to beta n xn for all the pillars that I forgot to include. Okay, which one was this? Volunteers. And what this shows is, if you get a coefficient for this beta, remember it's probably small, and then a coefficient for donors, maybe a little bigger, and a coefficient for volunteers, probably around the same, maybe, probably around the same. Let's just say it's around the same. And you keep going. What this tells us, just to put a cap on this, is that when we look at a table and it shows us the coefficients for all of these variables, and under the column for financial institutional report, the table reports 0.02, that tells us that once the researchers did their statistical regression, their statistical analysis, financial institutional support was not a major determinative factor for vote share. Whereas 0.2, not bad, okay, out of 1. It is moderately determinative, kind of small, but not as small as federal formal institutional support. And same for volunteer. This is usually the size of coefficients you see in a lot of political science. From 0.5, from 2.2 to 0.5 is usually the range you'll get. Sometimes you'll get less, sometimes you'll get more. What you also want to look out for is statistical significance, which is the stars on the table, usually next to the coefficients, that tell you whether or not the variable, or I should circle the actual variable, whether the variable, regardless of the size of the coefficient, because the coefficient can be really big and statistically insignificant if your sample size is small, but we don't get into that. Regardless of the number here, this tells us whether or not statistically, right, we observed an effect that we can say with a good deal of certainty was actually attributable to the variable itself, or if this is missing, if we don't see any stars next to a variable, that usually means it wouldn't really matter if we included this variable in our model. It's not really relevant in determining whether or not, for our purposes, somebody gets a certain amount of votes. All right. So I'll leave it there. I hope that this is a little bit helpful when you're going through these research papers. But like I said, this is not, you don't need to know this for the course. You're not going to be tested on it. But If you want to be someone who graduated with a degree in political science and is able to read political science research papers, so you're more informed than your next guy, your average Joe, it's useful to know, I think. All right, so that's it. Next, like I said, we'll go into a little bit on the media. And we'll talk about a little bit more about how it's not really the media that's as persuasive as we think it is. All right, so I will see you then.